Hello, everybody. Welcome to our breakfast briefing, Effective Devolution, Lessons Learned Over 10 Years. This is the first session within our spring series. We have another one coming up next week, which I'll give you a bit more details on at the end of this session. So all of these are short 45-minute long sessions to help busy policymakers better understand evidence on economic growth. I'm Megan Streb, Head of Outreach at the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. We help to make local growth policy more cost-effective through better use of evidence and evaluation. Today, we're going to cover both the effective use of data and evidence and economic thinking for effective devolution, and we're going to look at the importance of evaluation for using devolution to find out what works. Now, the reasons why we've split that is we'll detail that as we go through what the devolution white paper says. Now, please submit your questions throughout. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to move us on to the Q&A portion of the session. So please do raise questions as you have them. And we will move on to hear from our director, Henry Overman.
Thanks, and good morning, everyone. So let me just briefly start with a roadmap. We're not going to spend lots of detail on this because I think that there'll be many people on the call who will be in the details of this, but I wanted to start just checking we're on the same page. So where are we? We've had the English devolution white paper published in December, and it is proposing some changes to the structure of government. It's creating new regional units of devolution, strategic authorities, and there will be three types of these: foundation strategic authorities, mayoral strategic authorities, established mayoral strategic authorities, and then the two-tier local authorities to be reorganized into unitary authorities. Your view on this degree of reorganization may vary, but that's the route map. I think the bit of it that will be welcomed by everyone, even if some of the reorganization is not, is around local growth funding, and with the suggestion that local growth funding should be rationalized. So we're going to see no more competitive ports, more funding channeled via long-term local government finance settlement, and that's something that many of us have been calling for. Next slide, please, Megan. Now, like I said, that's just a sort of roadmap of where we are. We're not going to go into more details. If you want more details, there's a Centre for Cities webinar. There are partners. So Centre for Cities on the English Devolution white paper, you can get that on YouTube, or the LGA Devolution Hub has lots of great resources on this that will provide further information. Next slide, please, Megan. Here's what I do want us to focus on, which are the core arguments around devolution. And in fact, I'm going to narrow down on one of these. So there's two core arguments, one about democracy and one about policy outcomes. And I'm not going to touch the democracy stuff. I think it's hugely important, but it's not the focus of the What Works Growth Centre. Instead, I want to think about policy. The core arguments in favour of devolution in improving policy outcomes rest on two key arguments. The first of these is that local policymakers are better able to understand problems that they're experiencing in the local economy and how to fix them. So here's a quote from the English Devolution white paper: "Devolution enables more decisions to be made by those who know their areas best, leading to better outcomes and a more efficient use of resources." And then I think the second key argument that we would identify for why devolution should improve policy outcomes is that different places can try different policies, and doing this should help us find out what works best, and then other places can learn what works best. And here is another quote from the English Devolution white paper that gives a feeling for this. So devolution done right drives innovation, enabling different leaders to try out different methods and learn from what works to ultimately deliver more for citizens. Next slide, please, Megan. So we've split the presentation into two parts. I am going to deal with the first part on local policymakers being better able to understand their problems and how to fix them. And I'm going to specifically focus on effective use of data, evidence, and economic thinking. Now, there are a whole bunch of structural issues to do with public service delivery that sit behind that we're not going to touch on. Again, that's not really in our remit. I really want to narrow in on the things where we try and help local areas. And then next slide, Megan, thank you. One back. The second part of the presentation is going to deal with different places trying different policies. So, and the thing we're going to talk about there is the need for effective evaluation. And Victoria will talk about this. We really think that the important thing here is that we're realistic about what can be done at the local level and how places can best learn from one another. Thank you. Thanks. So, evidence in local growth. I mean, I'm going to be sort of fairly frank here about our experience of doing this. The What Works Centre has been around actually for 13 years, not 13 years, since 2013, so 12-ish years. And, you know, in that time, we've worked with a lot of different local and combined authorities to try and think about evidencing the needs of their local areas and trying to figure out what the policy response might be. And I think it's fair to say, and I hope that people recognize this, that capacity and capability for economic development varies significantly across places. And this is a major issue for local areas, but also for central government in the conversation it's having with local areas. After this call, you know, I'll be switching to do some work for the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council. You know, and a lot of what we're doing there is talking to different places about how they're going to intersect with the industrial strategy, and people's capacity to engage in those conversations varies widely. Now, why is that? Clearly, places vary a lot in size, and for obvious reasons, that affects staff capacity to deal with the issues that we're talking about. So that constraint, in some ways, we're always going to face. I think the second constraint that places face, which I think might be slowly changing but hasn't yet, is that economic development is not a statutory duty, and that means it's a choice. And for reasons that we can all understand, it falls behind other priorities, especially when resources are tight. Hopefully, some of the changes that we're going to see over the next couple of years will start to address those problems. And we'll come back at the end. Victoria will talk a little bit about the ways that we can help with that. I think the second thing here, which is beyond local authorities' control, but is a major issue, is that we've just seen so many shifts in the national policy landscape and what's required for government, local government. And that's not helpful either. Again, you know, I'm hopeful that we will see some changes here. As ever, I think, you know, we'll have to wait and see whether that really comes, but there certainly seems to be an intention to have less policy churn in these areas. And then I think the third reflection on how difficult it can be to properly evidence the policy interventions that we're going to do is I actually think many local growth policies aim to do too much too quickly. I think far too much of the language that we see is transformational. And I can completely understand from a local perspective why transformation might be so important, especially if you're in an area that is struggling. We want to do the best for people, and big changes feel like the way to do that. But actually, I often feel that really, given the powers, given the funding, given the responsibilities that we have, that focusing on more marginal changes is often more realistic. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about using data effectively. And as I said, once again, we're going to come back at the end and talk a little bit about what we can do to help you do this. But I think that it involves hitting a few key objectives. So my first point here is, I think actually often we really need to go back to basics. I think too much of the data analysis that we see and have seen over the years is confused about the question that it's trying to answer and why. And again, this partly is a capacity issue, but often the data analysis that we're seeing is muddling up, core concepts. It's confusing productivity and income. It's confusing employment, inactivity, unemployment. And I think that we need to make sure that the analysis that we're doing is really clear on really what outcome we care about, and why we're focusing on that outcome. Um, Linked to this, I think that we need to be better able to use the resources and the data that is available to us. I think there was 10 years ago, maybe slightly longer, when the Bean report came out. I think its criticism of the statistical resources and the data that was available to local areas was kind of fair. I think to be fair to ONS Local, they've done a lot of work to try and fix that. And I actually think the bigger issue now is probably in making sure that local areas are able to use the public data sets that are available to them. And this comes back to some of the capacity issues that I talked about. I think the third issue that I would highlight around using data effectively when we reflect on our experience is analysis really needs to use the geography that is relevant. I understand the politics around this, but ultimately, when you're engaging with the economy, you need to be thinking about the economic forces at work and the spatial scale at which they play out. And I think that often the politics of what the geography needs to look like interfere too much with the analysis, that the spatial scale at which the analysis needs to happen. And I think that is something that we need to think about how we address if we're going to use data effectively. And then the final thing that I would highlight with this is, in terms of lessons, is that I think that we struggle sometimes to put data into context. Some of this is about using trends over time when it's more illuminating to use levels, and other times it's the other way around. So let me give an example here. I think places argue far too much about where they are in the growth hierarchy, in terms of the rate of growth that we've seen over recent years, when UK growth performance has generally been terrible. So it doesn't take much to move up or down the rankings. I think far more important is to focus about where you are in terms of your relative performance. I think the second thing that I would highlight here over the years is that we just make comparisons that aren't very helpful. And I won't pick on any individual area here, but I'll pick on maybe the national government. I don't think it's helpful to pretend that we're going to go from having one of the poorest growth performances to being the best performing in the OECD. So, and I think that this flows through to the sort of policy development, etc., that we do. So I think that those are the four issues that I would really highlight about using data effectively. Next slide, please, Megan. The next set of challenges are around using evidence effectively. And here again, I think that a lot of what we see struggles from matching the right type of evidence to the right type of question. So a lot of the exercises that we do see are asking these descriptive or contextual questions. Is employment falling? How many local businesses are planning to expand, etc. I actually don't know how useful a lot of that analysis is. At the local level, most places don't have policy levers to do anything that is going to affect sort of what's going to happen in the next 12 months. Far more of what we need to be focusing on is our underlying structural issues that the economy is focusing, and that what we might be able to do to change that. Similarly, for reasons that I totally understand for areas having to manage the politics, I think it's important, obviously, that you understand what people feel about what's going on. So, are small and medium-sized enterprises more opposed to pedestrianisation and proposing than large businesses? After all, that's a vitally important role of local government, is to make sure that that can be taken into account. But it comes at a cost if we're not really thinking about, well, what will pedestrianisation do to the economic performance of our local area? And I think that probably too much of the analysis that we do, for reasons I really understand, hits on the first two of these, sort of the contextual stuff and understanding how people feel about stuff, and not enough on causal and mechanism questions. So about whether or not the changes that we're going to impose will actually cause the outcomes that we want. I mean, the second big issue that I really think here is that we don't use evidence early enough in the policymaking process. So I think that, and this a little bit comes back to a tendency to lean towards being strategic and talking about, these big changes. It pushes us away from being realistic about clearly articulating what an intervention is trying to achieve, being specific on outcomes that are measurable that we're trying to shift, and what the evidence says about whether we're going to be able to achieve that. And next slide, please, Megan. I said that we'd talk a little bit about the resources that we offer. Here's one way in which my thinking has really changed. I hated logic models when I first started with the What Works Centre about 11, 12 years ago. I increasingly have been converted to the fact that these are a good way of really starting to discipline our use of evidence in the formulation of policy development. So here's one where the lessons that I've done so far are reflecting what I've seen local areas doing over time. Here's a lesson I think that I take on how we've changed our approach, which is, we really do need to think about sense checking our approach. And in a world where resources are constrained and capacity is limited, I actually think logic models are a really good way to do this. They force us to think about whether intended outcomes are clearly linked back to outputs, activities, and inputs. And one of the things that I think I've observed here is often people do the logic model last when they're bidding to competitive bidding pots as a way of meeting requirements from central government. I think as we move forward, I'd like to see this much more fully integrated into the policy development process at the local level, because I really think that it's something that will help areas in using data and evidence in formulating effective policy. Right, that's me done. Over to Victoria.
Thank you, Henry. Megan, okay. That's fine. Sorry, the slides seem to have gone back to the first slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about evaluation and what we've learned from the last kind of 10, 12 years as a centre. So just before I do that, I'm going to reread the quote from the English devolution white paper that Henry had up earlier, which devolution, if done right, drives innovation, enabling different leaders to trial different methods and learn what works to ultimately deliver more for citizens. So if you actually believe that, if you believe that that's part of the case for devolution, that we're going to deliver better services through trial and error and learning what works, the only way you can really do that is through impact evaluation using a counterfactual. Okay, and that helpfully is our focus. So impact evaluation is important because it's the only way that you can establish causality. So what we mean by that is that the outcomes that you have seen are due to the intervention. Okay. Our experience over that kind of 10, 12-year period is that there's actually not much good quality, robust impact evaluation that uses a counterfactual that actually happens. So people may well know our evidence reviews, most of which were done within the first few years of the centre's life. So that was us going out and trying to find all of the impact evaluation from across the OECD on different policies, so on business support, on innovation, on apprenticeships, etc. When we did that exercise, we only found a small number, so in the tens rather than in the hundreds of studies, and actually only a small proportion of them came from the UK. And in the main, they had been done by academics. So what I mean by that is that an academic kind of come across a policy, thought it was interesting, and undertaken an evaluation. What there wasn't very much of was evaluations that had been commissioned by government departments or by local government of their policies. And our experience over the last 10 years is that has got a little bit better, but it hasn't got much better. So we're seeing more evaluation by central government. I think in particular in the last few years, the establishment of the evaluation task force as a kind of internal mechanism to encourage and drive and support impact evaluation has been positive. But it's not universal. Not every policy gets evaluated. And even where it is evaluated, there are a number of issues that, that mean that it's maybe not happening in the best way or the most effective way. And I'm going to talk about a few of them in a minute. If we look at local government, so across local authorities and combined authorities, actually there's very few examples of impacts evaluations that have been commissioned at that level. So there hasn't historically been much. There's a bit of improvement, but there's still quite a long way to go. I think there's an additional challenge here with devolution, which is if central government is getting a little bit better at commissioning impact evaluation, then that's great. But when it is devolving the funds to the combined authorities, unless combined authorities are able to do impact evaluation, you run the risk that actually we end up with a bit of gap in our evidence. I think if we think about impact evaluation as being a learning tool rather than an accountability tool, I think that can be an important way of kind of framing this, that in a sense it's a public good. But that is one of the reasons that we see real challenges in terms of getting evaluation actually happening, because you learn important things for you and the decisions that you're making. And actually the real value from this stuff comes from if everyone is doing it, we all learn a lot more because there are different lessons coming from different places. Megan, could you move on? Okay, so some of the things that we have learned over the last 10, 12 years are, I would say that the number one thing that we see is that even when evaluation is considered, it's often considered at far too late on in the process. Okay, so a policy will have been designed and often implemented before evaluation is considered. And that's a real challenge because the earlier you do this, the more options you have, the more different kinds of methodologies that you might be able to adopt. The design of your policy can align and facilitate the evaluation. So, for example, randomized controlled trials absolutely need to be set out before you implement your policy. You can't do it after the fact. But even if you're using one of the quasi-experimental methods, for example, if you're using scoring and using your threshold as the cutoff between your treatment group and your comparison group, actually you need to make sure that you're capturing the data that allows you to be able to see not just those who've got treatment, but those that applied were not successful. So thinking about this early can be critical in terms of making sure that evaluation can happen. There's also a question about what kinds of policies get taken forward. So something that we've seen at a central government level especially over the last kind of 5 years, is we've been seen a shift to large funds that there's scope to do lots of different things within. Okay, and what we know is that any policy that has multiple interventions and multiple outcomes is much more difficult to evaluate. So having narrowly defined interventions, having a narrow range of outcomes can be critical to being able to evaluate policy. Something that we see more at the local level is about scale. So because impact evaluations rely on statistical methods, you need statistical power, and that means that you need an intervention that is large enough to be able to deliver that statistical power. So there's definitely a thing about, when we have small scale interventions, it makes evaluation very difficult. But hopefully longer term funding, more consistent funding, integrated settlements should all help with that. Something else that we see, and this actually ties back a little bit to the point that Henry was making earlier, is that it's important to have very clearly defined and realistic outcomes, and it must be possible to be able to detect them. So you can't look at, you can't have a small intervention in a large area where lots of other things might be affecting that outcome. And really critically important is planning ahead. So planning can help make sure that you're capturing all of the data that you need systematically, but also there's a question about planning in terms of thinking about when you do your evaluation. You want to do it early enough where you're able to take the lessons and apply them in terms of your policy decisions, but you also need to wait long enough for the outcomes to come through. And something that we've seen quite a lot of over recent years is the evaluations happening too early and before the outcomes have come through. Megan, could you move on? Evaluation relies on data, so we need to make sure that we're able to access that data, and again that's often about assessing it at a very early stage and making sure that we're building processes in order to ensure that it's being captured. And then there's a whole bunch of kind of broader issues. So Henry talked about capacity in terms of data analysis, using evidence, but there's also a question about capacity in relation to both scoping out and managing evaluations. Linked to that is a question of kind of building external networks. Evaluations are very rarely done in-house, so you're going to need networks of consultants, academics, etc., that you might be able to draw on to support, but also networks with each other in terms of being able to support across the MCA network and more generally. And then in many ways, the very last one here is the most important. All of the things that I've kind of set out so far are about kind of tactical issues. How do you make sure that you're able to evaluate that, that you can kind of make it work? But actually, there's a much broader question about, is there a buy-in? Is there commitment to impact evaluation? There's lots of disincentives to doing it. Do you have politicians and senior management who understand the incentives, what you get from this, the learning that it provides? And Megan, can you click on? So, what can you do to prepare? I should say there's probably nothing on this that is very radical. And I think lots of places are already doing this. But essentially, we think there's kind of two elements to this. The first is about benchmarking your capabilities, both around the use of data and evidence and around evaluation. Specifically on data and evidence, we've got a maturity matrix on our website that helps you benchmark those capabilities. And then the thing that we think you do once you know where you're at is that you look to how you can build those capabilities and capacities going forward. We're very much here to help with that. We run lots of different training courses on different elements, data, evidence, evaluation, etc. And if you are from local government, in its broadest sense, and we have a practitioner community on K-Hub. So Megan can share details of that with anyone who is interested. Megan, can you click on? In addition to what local government should be thinking about in terms of responding to these structural changes, I think it's also worth thinking about like what can government do to help facilitate this. So we do know that they are interested in capability and capacity. So we think initiatives around that in terms of supporting are very important. We think, them absolutely focusing on fund simplification, consolidation, and making sure that funding is longer term will help all of this. Evaluation is one where there are particular challenges, and therefore we think that there should be incentives that come from central government to local government to help to encourage them to evaluate, but also that there should be support. So one idea that has been around for a number of years is the idea of there being a central evaluation body that can provide that support. There's also our colleagues in Centre for Cities did a report, I think last year, called LA Evidential. There's good recommendations in that would help as well. So things like reporting being sensible so that you're not spending all of your limited kind of research and evaluation, staff time, completing monitoring that doesn't get used. And again, making sure that the right incentives are in place. Just to finish up and to hand back to Megan for questions, this is something that, we're very passionate about the use of data and evidence and evaluation in local growth policy making. Everything that we do kind of touches on that in one way or another, but, do continue to engage with us. We're interested in what you would find most useful, and that can help shape our programme going forward. I'll hand back to Megan.
Great. Thank you so much, Victoria. I'm also going to invite Henry to join us for the Q&A portion. We've had a few questions in. Please do raise your questions. Even if we don't get a chance to answer them, it will certainly give us stuff to mull over and may influence other resources that we have. I think this is a good one to start with. Someone thought that the session was going to be focused more on the actual outcomes of evaluation and comparison between MCAs. I think that's an interesting one for us to start on, well, why haven't we been able to do that? And what do we hope is possible in the future?
Well, I mean, it comes down to the fact that MCAs are doing a whole bunch of things, and none of it is really being evaluated in a way that would allow us to do these comparisons. If people would like to see some of the difficulties with that, I think we've got this note on thinking about the adult education budget, which maybe we could pull out some of the lessons from, even if that's not publicly available. But it's just really difficult. I mean, when you've just got very diverse places, very diverse set of policy levers doing very diverse things, and no evaluation happening at the local level, we're a really small centre. We need to build on the stuff that's happened out there, and I'm afraid it's a lot of the evaluation just hasn't happened. The things where we have managed to do that usually come from stuff that has been better evaluated, for example, as a result of the structural funds, which has been done in multiple places. So we'll have, for example, an update to our area-based initiative briefing, which will talk about what we know about the relative successfulness of EZs, etc. But even there, a lot of that actually comes from the OECD, because a lot of the evaluation the central government has done of the structural funds, it's actually difficult to pull the lessons out from. So I think it's we can't do them individually. And if places don't do them and the central government doesn't do them, we don't have a lot of evidence to pull on. I'll stop there because I see tons of questions coming, and I'm happy to have a go at some of the others too.
We can certainly share the note with participants afterwards, which talks a bit about evaluating devolution and what would need to happen. One question that came in, there's often a sense of playing the game in competitive funds, and I think that's why maybe we see that transformative language that you mentioned, Henry. Does devolution, is that going to give an opportunity for more realistic outcomes?
I hope so. I'll let Victoria jump in if she wants. The phrase I use for this is that competitive bidding leads to mutually assured exaggeration. Right. I mean, we all know that that's the process, right? You get your, if you've done a realistic evaluation of your employment impacts, then you start thinking, oh, but hold on, we're bidding against something else. All the pressure is to scale up the effects that we think the policy is going to have because we're competing against other people. And I think the bad sides of that will go. I think the crucial lesson to take, though, as local and combined, is the thing I mentioned. Some of what central government makes you do, I think, is good. It actually is quite good to think about logic model. It is quite good to think about the evidence, the context, etc. And I think that a crucial thing for places is how they're going to make sure that that part of the process continues and is improved. So I think there's both a big benefit, and I think that benefit actually outweighs the risk. But I do think the risk is, what's your internal process that's going to replicate the kind of analysis and evidence that bidding for funds forces you to do? Because I think that that's a really important part of policy development.
Victoria, did you have anything you wanted to add on that one, or should we continue this rapid fire Q&A?
Continue the rapid fire.
Okay. So they kind of related to that around those internal systems. Someone's asked, they're aware that some places are bringing together benefits management and evaluation monitoring as a joint approach. Now, they mentioned specifically infrastructure schemes, but I think this is happening with all the MCAs that have a single assurance framework. Often there is a monitoring for assurance is sitting either separately or alongside evaluation. How is that a good approach, or should we have evaluation being seen as something separate to monitoring in terms of the process we have?
So I don't know masses about how that works in practice. I think the thing that is useful about that, so I think of benefit realization as kind of making sure that you are delivering what you are trying to achieve, that you're managing that through the process. Whereas evaluation is about understanding the effects that your intervention have had. I think the thing that's good about pulling both of those together is that they're both learning processes. I think one of the challenges with monitoring historically is it's been seen very much as a kind of an accountability issue. And I think European structural funds and the way their evaluation was structured, again, I think felt very much like an accountability stick. I think the value is that actually if we can make both of these things about, you've now got control of the budgets, you've got so much more discretion about how you're using them, use that as an opportunity to learn what are the best ways of achieving your goals. So I think there's maybe a mindset shift that is inherent in it that I think can be potentially helpful.
I think that's helpful. Right, we probably have time for one more. This is a nice, easy softball one. Treasury has the Green Book on project management. Would a similar book from government be developed for policy evaluation?
Well, there's the Magenta book. So that is a super easy one. Look, I think the real challenge here, though, is adapting those principles for local government to deal with the challenges that Victoria talked about. I'm quite, and in fact, this comes back to the previous thing. I think we do far too much non-robust evaluation to tick boxes and far too little sort of good monitoring and good evaluation to improve public service delivery. So I think that the crucial thing for local areas as we get into the next phase is, at the moment, you're used to ticking boxes on submitting proposals, for competitive bidding funds. You're used to ticking boxes on evaluation. You're used to central government saying to you, oh, this is what we want you to do. And as devolution proceeds, you've got to start asking what your own internal processes are for effective public service delivery. And that will grapple with how you use effective, we'll grapple with the things we've talked about. Let me answer one of the questions as an aside on that. My experience, it's hard to really know which policies have been effective. But if you think about the perception of which places have been most effective in their development, it is strongly correlated with them doing the stuff that we are talking about here. So I know places get fed up with hearing about GM, right? But GM has been the place that over 10 years we have found it easiest to engage with, because in terms of the narrower things we do, because they do think about how they're using data, monitoring, evaluation in their policy development process. Now, look, the other thing that they have, which we didn't touch on, is the stuff around democracy. And I think both of those things combine. And to be honest, as we've come, GM is not the only place, but it does stand out. There are some other combines and a small number of local authorities that also have done the things we talk about. And I do think that gives a feeling for the fact that they're more effective and better placed to deal with the changes that are coming.
Okay, we're gonna have to leave it there. If you work in local government, whether Greater Manchester or anywhere else, you can join us on K-Hub. So we'll be picking up some of the questions that didn't get answered, and maybe also revisiting some of the ones that did, in order to put content on there. So khub.net, and then we are the Local Economic Growth in the UK group. You can find us and join. That's just for people who work in local government. It's a place where you can speak to peers and you can ask us questions. Our next breakfast briefing is going to be next week on employment and income multipliers. Do join us for that. We're using the example of BBC relocation, but talking more broadly about multipliers and how to think about those in your policymaking. The notes that we have on devolution and what is possible in terms of understanding the impact of devolved interventions, you'll find that on the how to evaluate part of our website. If you haven't already signed up for our newsletter, you can find that at the bottom of our website. That's the best way to hear about future events and when new resources get published. This recording, if you want to watch it again, is already going to be on our YouTube page. You need to go to the live portion of our YouTube page, and we may also embed it on our website if you want to send it to colleagues who couldn't attend. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you at another event soon. Goodbye.